Before we jump right back into recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps, I just want to set the stage one more time, talking about our circular flow model of the economy and Keynes's insight, John Maynard Keynes' insight that the economy can get stuck, that it does not automatically equilibrate at full employment. The classical economists had this concept that the invisible hand through the price mechanism will keep moving things around until there's no surpluses and there's no shortages. And we really thought that was the case, but Keynes, looking at the situation beginning in 1929 and the downturn of the economy, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And it looked like the invisible hand theory, if it ever worked, was really broken, was really not salvageable, that it was not going to clear the economy of the shortage of jobs or the glut or surplus of workers. There were so many workers, they didn't have enough jobs to go around for the workers. And we said we wanted to keep our eye on this thing called unemployment as the central problem of recessions and depressions. And Keynes said the economy can get stuck in a depression. And there's no invisible hand that's going to get the macro economy out of a recession, depression. And although our rules of supply and demand and price equilibrium, yeah, they work for microeconomics, but once we make this mental jump from the world of microeconomics and begin to talk about the world of macroeconomics, it's not just the old stuff. Well, I'll say it differently. Everything that we thought was true under the old way of thinking, really the opposite is true with the new way of thinking. And a good way of showing that is called the paradox of thrift. And at a micro level, thrift is a very good thing, self-discipline, being able to save some money in order to create an investment in capital goods that increases productivity and increases output. The supply side, increase output, and everybody's better off. But the paradox of thrift says, well, what is true of the individual stays true in the microeconomic realm. But the paradox of thrift says that that same assertion has the exact opposite effect in the macroeconomic world. In other words, if everybody individually started saving and not spending, that is the very thing that will bring about an economic collapse, an economic downturn. And as he talked about it, a decline in demand. And that's why it was called demand-side economics. It would bring a decline in demand, and that decline could be permanent. It could stay down, which means that we could permanently be in a situation of an economic depression, and there is no invisible hand that's going to get rid of the lack of jobs or get rid of all these unemployed workers and find them work someplace out there. And therefore, the demand has to be augmented, has to be subsidized, has to have that gap filled by government spending. If consumers, and here is what Keynes called our consumption function, if consumers won't spend enough to keep full employment, and industry won't invest enough in buildings and inventory and assembly lines to make production go, and if foreigners won't help us out by demanding and buying our goods, well, then the only entity left is government to fill in the gap. Not that government would do that forever, but only in recessions and depressions, government needs to jump in and spend much more money than they take in order to stimulate that demand. And once we get that self-fulfilling prophecy going and people become optimistic in the economy again, well, then the government can back off and then collect more in taxes once the economy's rolling again than it spends. And although it deficit spends when times are really bad, when times are really good, it can have surpluses, and the surpluses will offset the deficit spending in the long run, was the general idea. Of course, it really didn't turn out that way. Politicians figured out that, wow, if we can spend more than we take in emergencies, and World War II was one of those emergencies, and things didn't go worse, things really got better, well, then after World War II, why can't we continue to deficit spend? Why can't we continue to go into debt to buy things? Because we might have a catastrophe in education. We have to get all these people educated, and so we're going to have to spend more money we take in for education, or we're going to have to spend more money we take in for putting a man on the moon. We can't let the Russians take over space. This is an emergency, and so we're going to spend more than we take in to beat the Russians to the moon and conquer outer space. And once the politicians got the idea that they could spend more than they take in, not just for emergencies anymore, not just for desperate situations like the Great Depression, but we could do that on a continuing basis, then we have this idea that spending more than you take in, no, you can't do that as an individual, but as a nation, when it comes to sovereign debt. Sovereign debt was seen as something exceptional, something different than individual debt. An individual cannot go into debt greater and greater and greater and greater and greater. Pretty soon no one will lend to them because they can't pay it back. What's that old saying? If you owe the bank $100,000, you're in deep trouble. But if you owe the bank $100 million, the bank's in deep trouble. Right? Anyway, something along those lines. And all of a sudden, the bank's in trouble rather than the individual's in trouble. So we have this situation. If the government's going to save the day and save the economy through fiscal policy, and the two tools of fiscal policy are taxing and spending, well, the government's now in this tightrope situation where full employment, full potential income, or if we come up to this line, potential expenditure, to get the economy going where we have everybody employed and all the factories are producing at their maximum capacity, then that's dependent upon the government's economists to be able to figure out how much additional spending, how much additional demand does the government need to put into the economy. Now, the idea when we talk about the inflationary gap, which we're talking about today, we talked about the recessionary gap last time, where there wasn't enough spending, and so we just fall into a recession and we stay there. So if the government doesn't do enough, we could fall into a recession and stay there. And today we're going to talk about if the government makes a mistake and spends too much, and the economy is overheated, is a term, overheated, well, then we could run into an inflationary situation. An inflationary situation, now when you hear the word inflation without anything with it, you know we're talking about price inflation. If the government spends too much and pushes us past full employment, then, well, everybody that's hired is already hired, and we don't have any more people to be hired, even though we've got more demand. Then that puts us into an inflationary situation. So the government's walking this tightrope. If it doesn't do enough, we're going to stay in a depression. If it does too much, then we're going to fall into an inflationary situation. And so it's got to figure out exactly how much is enough and not too much. It's like peas porridge cold and peas porridge hot. And is this porridge just warm, or is it going to burn your mouth, or is it too cold? And now this government's walking the government's walking this fine line to keep the economy at precisely full employment. The idea that the government, through deficit spending, or a combination of spending and taxes, can keep the economy out of a recession and out of an inflation is called fine-tuning the economy. It's called fine-tuning the economy. One more time. The idea that fiscal policy, that is the government taxing and spending at various levels, can keep the economy at exactly full employment with no recession and no inflation is called fine-tuning the economy. Some of you might have experience with shortwave radios or the old AM radios that I don't know how many people listen to them today. But they would have the dial, and as you get closer and closer to a station, it goes fuzzy, fuzzy, fuzzy. The station comes in really, really clear. You keep on turning, it turns fuzzy, 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 and some other station comes in. Okay? So if you've got this great big handle here that moves it a whole bunch, well, then you barely touch the thing and it goes too far, and it goes too far in this direction. But if we have a smaller dial that you can just tweak it just a little bit, that's our fine tuner, and here's a gross tuner over here. Our fine tuner can just get it right where we want it. That's what we mean by fine tuning. I would hazard to say that no matter what school of economics we're talking about, the vast majority of economists are now of the opinion that it is no longer conceivable that the government has the ability to fine-tune the economy. To fine-tune the economy. We can move it one way, but sometimes it just goes a little bit too far. And then you got to push it back. Oh, it goes too far this way. And we can influence, but sometimes our influence is sometimes more of a problem than it is a solution. Try to give you an example. Have you any of you remember driving a car and the play in the steering wheel, I mean, is a whole lot. Like you got to turn it halfway before it starts to do anything. Then you got to turn it halfway back here before it starts to do anything. So you turn it, you turn it, turn it. So you really turn it, go, whoa, go this way. Then you turn it, and then you go the other way. That's the kind of situation we're talking about with the government trying to control the economy through fiscal policy. So now we're going to go back, although I've just told you that actually most economists don't believe that we can actually do this. One reason that you should know it is that for a half a century at least, economists believed we could. Not only economists believed we could control the economy, but the politicians believed that we control the economy too. So from a historical perspective, we need to understand the past. We need to understand this Keynesian model just simply to understand past policy as well. Was there a hand out there? Yes. Fine-tuning the economy is the idea that that government spending and taxing, fiscal policy, fine-tuning is the idea that we can control the economy precisely through fiscal policy. The idea that we can control the economy precisely through fiscal policy. Of course, policy is made up of two parts, taxing and spending. So now with that introduction, we should maybe pause now before we actually go into the topic for today, and that's called the inflationary gap. We'll start next time in next session with that.